Okay, so we all know that building your leadership skills is important, but there are a few things, situations that as a leader never really get any easier, no matter how much time you spend practicing, studying, and building those skills. I've certainly felt all of these myself, and I know my peers have as well. So today I'm going to unpack what those common situations are and exactly how to deal with each one when they do inevitably show up. Welcome to the Honest Leadership Series, where we talk about how to become better, more honest leaders in a world that's filled with the opposite. My promise is to give you simple actions that you can take, not just some theory to admire from a distance. So if that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing and leaving a like if this episode helps you in any way. You know, I've spent about 16 years now in one of the largest companies in the world, most of that being a leader. And one of my favorite things to do is to sit with and talk with other leaders, my peers, about the common frustrations, the difficulties, and learn from each other. And that's the community that I'm trying to build here on this platform. So I would really appreciate it if you would consider joining and being a part of that community. And we're going to learn together. So let's go ahead and get into some of those situations that I just said. They just don't get any easier. The first one, as a leader, you will be misunderstood a lot by people whose respect you actually want. And the maddening part of this is you'll be misunderstood for usually doing the right thing. It shows up differently depending on, who's looking at you. Your team sees you slow down on something, let's say, or get cautious about a decision, and they read that as you're just dragging your feet. But what they don't see is some legal review or question or some confidential personal matter, the policy question that you can't discuss right now. And all of that sits kind of quietly underneath the caution. Another way it shows up is through your peers. Your peers might feel like you're not supporting them enough, that you're not doing your part. But what they don't see are three other priorities that you're carrying that are genuinely more important than what they think you should be doing right now. And then the most dangerous one is your boss. Your boss might think that you're not moving fast enough on a decision. But what they don't see from 30,000 feet are these obstacles that you're actively trying to avoid or mitigate before they even happen. You're doing the right thing. They just don't see it yet. And, if we're honest, some of this is simply because we don't have enough time and energy to explain every move in excruciating detail to every single person. That's just the reality of the job. You're not being secretive. You're not playing favorites. You're not hiding something. But the reaction you get certainly can feel that way. And that gap between what's actually happening and what you're doing and how it looks is what makes this so hard. And sometimes it even gets stranger than that, because sometimes the reason you made a decision becomes completely clear months later. But by then, the damage, we'll say, to how people see you has already happened. And, nobody thinks to go back and say, oh, now I get it. That was a great move. So why do we fear being misunderstood so much? Why is this such a burden for us to carry? Well, some of it is short term. Like when people that you respect misunderstand a decision that you made, it's really easy to start second guessing not just how you handled it, but whether that decision itself was even right to begin with. It takes some real confidence to keep moving forward when the people whose approval you normally want are looking at you kind of sideways. It's also just like this low-grade background stress that sits on you. Walking into a room knowing that the people are quietly frustrated with you or don't think that you're doing the right thing, and you can't fix it right then and there with any explanation. And underneath both of those is a fear that this silence is going to cost you some amount of reputation, that people are going to form some story about your ability as a leader, about whether you're actually competent, without you ever being in the room to defend yourself. I'm not a psychologist, but I think this is true about human psychology. When people don't have the full picture, their brain just doesn't sit there and go blank. It fills in that gap with some type of story. It's the same reason that you pass someone in the hallway and they don't say hi back, and then by the time you get to your desk, you're trying to decide if they're mad at you or if you did something to tick them off. People do that to you too, right? Without you knowing. Not because that they're out to get you, but because that's just what brains do with incomplete information. That's not something that you caused, and it's not something that you can even stop. The only real question is whether you are going to spend your energy trying to control every story people tell themselves about you, or just let some of it exist without needing to fix it. So how do we overcome this one though? Well, I think the first thing that you can do is get yourself a mentor. Somebody like a peer or maybe a little bit above you who you can tell the whole story to and share those frustrations. Someone that can hold that full picture with you so that you're not carrying every hard and messy situation completely alone. That one relationship will quiet a lot of that second guessing that comes from these situations. The second thing that you can do is that when you're making a decision that your team doesn't agree with, you can kind of say so out loud to them. You can sit down with them and say, hey, I know you don't agree with this. Here's what I can tell you about it, but there are also things that I can't talk about and that I can't share, and that I need you to trust me on that and just respect that there's some things that have to stay confidential right now. That kind of honesty about the limits of your transparency might build more trust than just ignoring the tension altogether. But be careful with this one and be discerning about it. You don't want to instigate more rumors or stories that they're going to just make up in their heads in place of those things that you just told them that you have to keep confidential. And the third one is with your boss specifically. This is the one place where getting ahead of that narrative is probably worth the effort. Set up some time to walk through it with them. Share your rationale clearly, step by step. They might have some hesitation still about what your approach is, but walking them through your thinking and your rationale shows them that you've put some real thought into it. And that's going to build some trust in your judgment, even when they're not fully sold on whatever your path might be at the moment. But with all of these, just remember that as a leader, you're not under any obligation to expend your energy trying to control every story people tell themselves about you. I know that's easier said than done, and unfortunately, that's why it's on my list. Let's talk about the second thing now. At some point, you're going to have to stand in front of your team and deliver a decision that you didn't make, and maybe you don't even agree with. This one's hard because you're actually doing two jobs at once here. On one side, you're an agent of the organization. You have to carry out its decisions. But on the other side, you're the leader of your team, the person whose job it is to protect them, to advocate for them. And most days, those two roles line up perfectly. But in these moments, they just don't. So let's say someone above you, someone makes a decision, a policy change, a budget cut, a change in direction, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. And you're the one who has to discuss it with your team, field their questions, and then handle the pushback. Well, the first leader, let's say they handle it badly. They deliver the news and then position themselves as kind of one of the team members, bad-mouthing leadership, rolling their eyes, playing up just how unfair the decision is. It's really just a performance, and the audience is their team, and man, that team is going to pick up on that. Now, picture a leader who handles this just a little bit better. They don't pretend to love the decision if they don't, but they also don't perform their disagreement for the room. They deliver it as directly as they can. They answer what they can, and they hold that line with their team. Because in that moment, that is their job. That leader isn't lying about how they feel. They're just choosing not to make their own discomfort the team's problem to manage. Here's why that distinction matters so much. Your team can tell the difference between a performance and honesty almost every single time. A leader who handles this isn't hiding what they feel. They're just staying honest with the boundaries of still being an officer of the company and a leader of that team, both at once. So how do you actually overcome this one? Well, first, remember that pushing back against those decisions is part of your job, not just something that you're allowed to do. So in that room where that higher level decision is being made, and if you get the chance, it's your responsibility to advocate for your team and to push for the real why behind that decision. If you do that well, you walk out with something more valuable than just an answer or the mandate. You walk out with the real reasoning behind the decision, not just some mandate that your team now has to comply with. And then second, if you have any room at all to shape how the decision gets implemented, even if you can't change what it is, use it. You may not have control over the what, but sometimes you can control the how, the timeline and the tone and how it's communicated to your team. That's real influence, even if it doesn't feel like it to you in the moment. And then the third thing that you can do is that when you talk to your team, tell them the truth about your role without undermining the decision itself. Something like, this wasn't my call to make alone, but it is my job to help us move through it well, and here's how we're going to do this. That's honest, and it's also leadership. It doesn't throw anyone under the bus, and it doesn't pretend that you have more control or influence than you do. Sometimes your job is going to be to defend a decision that you don't agree with, but I think there are good ways to go about this that don't undermine your company or keep you from being an advocate for your people. It's just, unfortunately, really hard to do both. Okay, so let's talk about this last one. You never really get to make an easy decision. By the time something gets to you, it's already hard. Because if it were easy, someone else would have already handled it. A lot of leadership training sets you up to expect that it's going to be easier than that. It hands you these really clean, black and white scenarios, exactly how you know it's time to fire someone. Here's the checklist for who gets promoted. Here's the 4-step model for how to handle conflict. Those frameworks, they aren't necessarily wrong, but they just miss the thing that makes your job hard in the first place. These are real situations. They're always messy. They never show up clean. I think about back in math class in like high school or college, wherever, where the textbook gives you these problems, examples to solve, and you work through them and you get really good at them and you start to feel like you actually know this stuff. But then you get down to the test and somehow every single question, every one of them is like 10 times harder than anything that you learned in the book. That's kind of how I think about leadership. All your training, the courses, the books, the workshops, those are the textbook type problems. But the real decisions that land on your desk are the test questions that nobody really can prepare you for. Think about like an employee that you're deciding whether to fire. They aren't some cartoon slacker. They're just inconsistent. Maybe they're great some weeks. Maybe other weeks they're just completely checked out. And you genuinely don't know if they're burned out. Maybe they're just disengaged or going through something that you don't know. Or maybe it's a promotion. Promotions aren't between some obvious star and an obvious dud. It's between two people. Both of them really good, maybe in just different ways, and picking one means turning down the other. Every situation that actually reaches you got there because it is tangled and it is really messy. This is hard because it means you can't coast on frameworks. You can use them as a starting point, but at some point you have to close the book and just make the decision anyway with incomplete information, knowing that there's a chance you might be wrong. I've spent a lot of time leading teams inside of a large organization, and I've sat in a room with a lot of different leaders and shared some scenario, and I've watched every single leader recommend a different approach or different situation. What that's taught me is that in most situations like these, there really isn't a right answer just waiting to be found. There's just your decision and how you execute it. And honestly, that execution matters more than which option you picked. So how do you actually overcome this? Well, I think the first thing that you could do is build a very short list of people who you can trust enough to think out loud with before making a decision. Not to hand them the problem, but because it almost always surfaces something that you hadn't considered yet. And second, make peace with deciding on incomplete information. Gather what you reasonably can, and then just set a deadline to stop gathering, and then just decide. I use this analogy sometimes. I say, don't be a squirrel. You can go left, you can go right, it doesn't really matter which direction you choose. But the only thing that you can't do is stay in the middle of the road. So those are the 3 things that are hard for me, that are on my list, that never get easier. But what I'd like to know now is what situations are on your list? What things do you feel like are always difficult, no matter how many tools you have to deal with them? I'd like to hear all of those in the comments and maybe how you deal with them. Thank you so much for watching. I sincerely hope this helps you and that maybe you found this encouraging, that it's not just you. And if it did, please leave a like or subscribe before you go. And I really, really hope to see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.